The EU-Mercosur trade agreement has been almost 25 years in the making. Now that it's finally moving toward ratification, it has become one of the most politically explosive trade deals Europe has faced in a generation. Negotiations between the European Union and the Mercosur bloc, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, began around the turn of the millennium. Talks stalled repeatedly through the 2000s, mainly over agriculture and protectionism, before being formally relaunched in 2016. A breakthrough came in 2019 when both sides announced an agreement in principle, but the deal then froze again amid environmental objections and political resistance in Europe. Momentum returned after Brazil's leadership change in 2023, and in December 2024, EU and Mercosur leaders announced a political agreement, marking the end of a long diplomatic process. By late 2025 and early 2026, EU member states gave provisional approval, clearing the way for signature. The final hurdle now is ratification by the European Parliament. What's in the deal is broad. The agreement covers goods, services, investment, public procurement, and sustainable development. At its core is tariff liberalization. Mercosur would remove tariffs on around 91% of EU exports over time, while the EU would remove tariffs on roughly 92% of Mercosur exports. According to the European Commission, that could save EU exporters more than €4 billion a year in customs duties once fully implemented. The biggest gains are concentrated in specific sectors. Mercosur currently imposes high tariffs on European strengths. Car parts face duties of around 35%, machinery around 20%, chemicals about 18%, and pharmaceuticals roughly 14%. Those barriers would be phased out over periods ranging from 10 to 15 years. Tariffs on cars and electric vehicles would fall especially slowly, with some transitions stretching close to 2 decades. Agriculture is where the controversy lies. The EU agreed to limited quota-based access for Mercosur beef, poultry, sugar, and ethanol. Beef imports, for example, would rise by about 99,000 tons a year, phased in over 5 years, roughly 1 to 2% of EU consumption. In exchange, Mercosur would lower tariffs on European food and drink exports like wine, olive oil, chocolate, and some dairy products, while recognizing hundreds of protected EU food names. Safeguards are built in. If imports surge or prices undercut EU producers beyond defined thresholds, Brussels can suspend tariff preferences quickly. The EU has also set aside adjustment funding and tightened monitoring, especially for sensitive farm sectors. Environmental commitments are a major part of the political sales pitch. The agreement ties both sides to the Paris climate framework and includes language on halting deforestation. EU officials say these commitments can be enforced through suspension mechanisms, though environmental groups argue the clauses remain weak in practice. The reaction has been sharply divided. European farmers have staged large protests across France, Ireland, Belgium, Poland, and elsewhere, warning that even small increases in imports could devastate local producers. Environmental groups argue the deal risks encouraging deforestation in South America. By contrast, exporters, industry groups, and several EU governments argue the agreement opens vital markets and strengthens Europe's economic position. Politically, Europe is split. Export-heavy countries like Germany and Spain back the deal. France, Poland, and others oppose it, largely over agriculture. Mercosur governments, especially Brazil, have strongly endorsed the agreement, framing it as a win for multilateral trade. Economically, the headline impact is modest. Commission-backed studies estimate the deal would raise EU output by around 0.1% in the long run, with gains spread over more than a decade. Mercosur economies could see slightly larger percentage gains. Most of the benefits arrive slowly, as tariffs phase out over 10 to 15 years, meaning there's no near-term growth boost. That's why the deal matters less for short-term GDP and more for strategy. It deepens EU ties with Latin America, reduces reliance on single suppliers, and improves access to critical raw materials. It also sends a signal that the EU is still pursuing large-scale trade agreements at a time when global trade is fragmenting. In the end, the EU-Mercosur deal is not about a sudden economic surge. It's about long-term positioning, with clear winners, vocal losers, and a political fight that is far from over.